Right, sir. So now we have the next session on Chasing the Orient Express by Atulya Sinha. And the moderator for the session is Mr. J.L. Singh, a mechanical engineer by, I'll just introduce Mr. J.L. Singh first, a mechanical engineer by qualification and a railwayman by profession. Nevertheless, J.L. Singh's first love is rail enthusiasm. Having spent a lifetime in the railways, he has now retired from active service, but not from the railway world. One of Rail Enthusiast Society's founder members, he is its secretary and also the editor of its quarterly journal. As part of his work with the Indian Railways and Rights Limited, he has travelled widely and worked with railways and rail-related areas in India and all continents except Antarctica, giving him a comprehensive picture of rail activity and rail enthusiasm the world over. Over to you, Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Manoj. While it is always good introducing speakers, I have more pleasure than normal introducing Atulya Sinha because I first met him 40 years back when he was my student when I was professor at the Indian Railways Institute of Mechanical and Electrical Engineering. Therefore, if you find that his talk is good, it is because of the good training that I gave him, plus the good values that I inculcated in him. If his talk is not good, it only means he didn't heed what I had taught him. Anyway, Atulya had a long stint in the railways. His entire working life was spent in the railways. He has held many important positions, like the Divisional Railway Manager of Sonpur Division, the Additional General Manager of the Southeastern Railway Zone of the Indian Railways, and he finally retired from service as the Principal Chief Administrative Officer of the Rail Wheel Manufacturing Plant at Bela in the state of Bihar. Today in his talk, he'll be searching for the Orient Express, a train that evokes emotion and say elegance at the same time. I hope that by the end of his talk, he has found the Orient Express. So over to you, Atulya.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your introduction. Let me start with the quote. Paul Theroux says, "It goes without saying that the Orient Express is the most famous train in the world." Now, yesterday, when this conference started, more than one speaker mentioned the Orient Express. So I had mixed feelings about this. On one hand, I was happy that they're talking about my train. But at the same time, I was a bit worried that if they say everything which is to be said about this train, there'll be nothing left for me. But I hope I'll have something new to add to what has already been said. So before we start about the Orient Express itself, we have to go back in time to the 1860s. This is what the map of Europe looked like in the 1860s. This is a railway map published in 1863. Now, the first thing which you will notice about this is that there is a dense network in the UK and France and Germany, which gets less dense as you go east and as you go south. Now, Europe of those days had a number of features which are relevant for our purpose. The first thing is that all the countries were monarchies. Some had limited powers, the others were absolute monarchies. And they had empires. What you can see in the map is the French Empire, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. The major empires which you can see here. And there was colonization. These European powers had colonies all over the globe, and there was trade. There was a lot of trade which these powers had, and because of that, they were becoming rich. Naturally, there were economic and political rivalries between these powers, and the maps were changing continuously. Industrialization was taking place. There were new technologies, particularly the railways, which started in the 1820s and 1830s. And now we're talking of 1860s. So as you can see, there is quite a substantial network in Europe. And it's important to remember that there were islands of affluence. there was still a lot of poverty in Europe. There was not much of a middle class. Dickens was writing at that time, if you remember. So there were a lot of a lot of poverty, a sea of poverty, and in the midst of that, there were islands of affluence. So when we consider all these factors, what is missing? How do you fill the gap? And this is the missing factor. There was a need for safe and comfortable long distance travel so that the elite, the rich and the powerful, who occupied the islands of affluence, they could move from one island to another safely and comfortably. In those days, there were no planes, there were no automobiles, there were just trains, and trains were still being developed. Right. So now we come to the Orient Express, which was much more than a train. Let us begin with the story of the Belgian entrepreneur, George Nigel Makers. He belonged to a prominent Belgian Jewish family. His family were bankers, but he chose to become an engineer. He was suffering from a heartbreak, and his family decided to send him to the United States for a vacation. He was there for nearly a year, and he had an opportunity to see Pullman's luxurious sleeper cars which were running there. Now, there's some controversy about whether he actually contacted Pullman and Pullman refused, or he didn't get a chance to meet Pullman. But either way, he decided to set up his own rival company when he returned to Europe. And it was the International Sleeper Car Company. Forgive me if I'm not able to pronounce the original French name. It was established in 1872 to provide seamless train travel across Europe. There were various technical and commercial constraints because, remember, all the railway systems were independent, and commercial constraints also. Each country had its own currency, for example. The European Union was still a century away. The technical standards were different, the languages were different, and he had to overcome a lot of these constraints. And so Nigel Makers negotiated with the governments of 8 countries, and he decided to introduce a train from Paris to Istanbul, a distance of more than 3,000 kilometers. New rolling stock was designed. This is a Wagon Lee. Wagon Lee is the name of the company. Wagon Lee dining car of 1883, which was about 50% longer than the other coaches which were in use in Europe at that time. The inaugural trip took place from Paris in 1883. At the station, you could see the who's who of Paris, or perhaps Europe itself. On the train, the passengers included Nigel Makers himself, ministers from different countries like France, Belgium, and Turkey, and leading journalists who were invited to cover the journey. There were many surprises during the journey. The first surprise was at the platform itself, when a battered steam loco with 2 rusty carriages were brought into the platform, and people thought that this was the Orient Express. Well, when there was an uproar, this train was quietly removed, and the real gleaming new Orient Express train was placed on the platform. When the journey started, the passengers were pleasantly surprised to find the luxurious interiors and the catering arrangements. They had very skilled chefs, and they sourced their ingredients from different parts of Europe. So they traveled very comfortably. They were very well fed. They enjoyed the journey, but it came to a nasty halt when they hit the Danube River in a town called Giorgio. Now, there was no bridge there, and a bridge wouldn't be built there till the 1950s. So they were told to get off the train. They had to board ferries and cross the river. And on the other side, they traveled in an ordinary train up to the coast to a town called Varna. And from Varna, they went by ship to Istanbul. Now, before we continue, let us hear from one of the journalists who was aboard the train. This was Blowitz. He was a very famous journalist of those times. And in fact, he was the Times correspondent, the Times London correspondent in Paris. And he traveled on this train. And among other things, this is what he said. The landscape flies at your feet. The streams seem to flow under the wheels. Villages and houses shine like morning stars. And from your Rue de la Paix, you can see the minuscule population of little world. Now, in case you're wondering about this word, Rue de la Paix, it was an exclusive shopping center of Paris in those days. I believe it is still an exclusive shopping district. So this train was described as a magic carpet to the east. Now, a magic carpet, as I said earlier, is something which connects one point to another. And if you remember, I mentioned a sea of poverty and islands of affluence. And this train was like a magic carpet which connected one island to another. Now, on the map on the left, you can see the route. I hope you can see my mouse. Initially, the train came up to here, and then they crossed the river here, and they came to the city called Varna, and they went by ship from here. And 1889 onwards, they came from Budapest to Belgrade, Sofia, and Constantinople. And this is a picture of the first Orient Express, which reached Istanbul in 1889. This is how the occasion was described. Suddenly, the air was filled with whistles and the clatter of steel as the new iron visitor ground to a halt. Applause and cheers arose. Just 68 hours earlier, this train had lurched out of Paris's Gare de l'Est, sped across Europe, and now deposited its passengers in Constantinople's newly built Sirkeci station. At long last, the Orient Express had arrived. Now, this train was called the King of Trains and the Train of Kings. This is the aspect which most of us would be familiar with. Kings and crooks, millionaires and refugees, big game hunters and smugglers, prima donnas and courtesans traveled on it. Tycoons and financiers clinched their deals across its sumptuous dining tables. Diplomats, spies, and revolutionaries on board the train moved secretively to their moments of history. Now, there are a lot of stories associated with the Orient Express. Let me share some of them. By stories, I mean something which really happened. I don't mean fiction. We'll come to fiction later. First, let us talk about the real stories. So, this is a picture of Tsar Boris III, the ruler of Bulgaria from 1918 to 1943. He was a passionate rail fan, and he was so committed to railways that he actually applied to become an engine driver when he was the crown prince, and he qualified. So very often he would drive trains himself. But that was in his own country. He would travel as a passenger on the Orient Express, and the moment the train entered Bulgaria, he would get it stopped, get down from his carriage, get onto the locomotive, and then start driving it himself. Now, he was a qualified engine driver, but he was not very particular about speed restrictions. So he liked to drive the train as fast as it could go. On one occasion, he insisted that the fireman, there's a fireman on steam locomotives who loads coal into the firebox to make steam. So he kept pressurizing the fireman, and the fireman, being a subject of his, couldn't refuse till the fire built up to a very high level. And unfortunately, this poor man, this fireman's clothes caught fire. So he jumped off the train in a bid to extinguish the fire, but unfortunately his fall was fatal because the train was running at a high speed. After that, Tsar Boris was not allowed to run this train. Yesterday we heard about the Maharaja's Express, which is an exclusive train run on Indian Railways. But the Orient Express was the original Maharaja's Express. A number of Indian Maharajas traveled on it. The Maharaja of Kuch Bihar, for example, booked an entire sleeper and a dining car for his party in 1907. And he had these coaches modified to suit his taste. And he used to give away diamonds as tips. The Maharaja of Kapurthala was also said to be a regular traveler. This Orient Express plays its part in history. During the First World War, it stopped running. But Marshal Foch, who was a high-ranking general in the French army and eventually became its head, he took over 3 carriages of the Orient Express, which became his temporary headquarters during the war. And another one, 2419, was equipped as an office. And the armistice was signed in this coach on 11th November 1918. So we all know that the First World War began in Sarajevo when Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated. But not many of us would know that it actually ended in a railway carriage, and it was a carriage of the Orient Express. Another interesting story, is the defenestration of a president. Now, defenestration, literally and metaphorically, it means throwing out of the window. This is a newspaper of the time, and this is the gentleman we are talking about. His name is Monsieur Paul de Chanel. He was the president of France, and he was traveling on the Orient Express, and he fell out of the window of his carriage in May 1920. Now, his supporters say that he was trying to get some fresh air by opening the window. His critics said that he was drunk and he fell out. But anyway, the train was not moving at a very high speed, so he fell near the track and he kept lying there. And after a while, he was found by a track maintainer. And this man asked him who he was and what he was doing there. So he says, I am the president of France. Now, this man was shocked and he said, in that case, I must be Emperor Napoleon. Well, they took him. He called for help and they took him to a nearby hut of a railway employee. And meantime, the train moved on because his staff thought that he had gone to sleep. And in the morning, it was discovered that he was no longer on the train. And this created quite an uproar. And after a few months, he had to resign from his post. And so, as I said, it was both literally and metaphorically a defenestration. Now, the Orient Express had very intricate timetables. When it started, at every major station throughout the route, some carriages would be detached and some would be attached. We must remember that the Orient Express was not the only train which was running, the only luxury train which was running in Europe in those days. It was not a cruise or a holiday train. It was a timetable train. And there were similar other timetable trains running throughout Europe in those days. And at every major station, they would attach and detach a few carriages. So you could board or you could arrive at stations which were not directly on the route. They also used multiple currencies because there were no euros in those days. This was the picture taken in 1950. And you could pay in dollars, pounds, Swiss francs, French francs, or Italian lira, perhaps Turkish lira also. And they also had their own coupons. Now, post the Second World War, when Europe was changing and there was an Iron Curtain which descended across the continent, This is what an author says. Because the train connected alien ideologies and economies, it was distrusted by every state it crossed, resulting in prolonged stops on the borders. So every border crossing, which used to be a source of pride in the early years, that they went through the borders very quickly, now it became a handicap that every border crossing was delayed. This was the beginning of the decline. And in the meantime, as we know, air travel and road travel also developed. And so so we come to this slide. If it looks like an obituary, it is intentional. Let me read out the quote. The Orient Express ended its days ignominiously as a little more than a sleeping car attached to a succession of local expresses. And the very last departure from Paris in May 1977 consisted of one shabby sleeper car with three scruffy day coaches and no restaurant car. If you remember the prank played by Nigel Mackers nearly 100 years earlier, now this had come true. This was a very sad day. Now, on this map, we can see the multiple versions of the Orient Express. The red one uh, is the one which I mentioned earlier, which went through Varna earlier and then directly to Istanbul. Then came the green one, which was called the Simplon Orient Express. The Simplon tunnel was underneath the Alps on the border of Switzerland and Italy. It was inaugurated in 1906. And after that, from 1919 onwards, after the First World War, it became the main route of the Orient Express, which went along the green route. And then came the Aalborg Orient Express, which ran for some years. And then the yellow one is the successor Orient Expresses, which ran shorter and shorter routes, and they became less and less exclusive. And the last one ended in 2009. And then finally, the Orient Express was born in a new avatar. There was an American hotel magnate and rail enthusiast named James Sherwood. After 1977, he started collecting the original carriages of the Orient Express, and he restored them by spending millions of dollars. And he started running a train known as the Venice Simplon Orient Express. Now, this was not a timetable train. This used to run only for tourists. This started running in 1982, and it still runs it as a luxury train. Now, it does one or two trips from Paris to Istanbul all the way, one or two trips in a year, and it does a few other trips to other locations, but they're all exclusively for tourists, for nostalgia seekers, for holidaymakers. It's not run as a timetable train any longer. So let me share some traveler's tales about the Orient Express. But before that, I must tell you about the title of this presentation, which is Chasing the Orient Express. And this is my story. The first time I went to Europe, was when I visited Paris in 2008. Paris, as you see, is here. Now, at that time, I didn't know, but I was chasing the Orient Express. I did one train journey from Paris to Lille, which is on the border of Belgium. Belgium, if you remember, is the home country of Nigel Mackers, who started the Orient Express. But then I was not aware of this connection. The next time I visited Europe was 4 years later, and this time my wife was with me. You can see us sitting at a railway station on a bench, and you can see tracks behind us. We traveled from Prague to Ostrava, which was not really on the route of the Orient Express, but earlier, before the main Orient Express started, there was a connection from Vienna to Ostrava, the other way, which Nigel Mackers had started. Next, my next visit to Europe was in 2018 when I visited Milan again with my wife, and we actually traveled from Milan to Venice, which was on the route of the Simplon Orient Express. So we are getting closer and closer. And finally, in 2019, we went on a vacation to Istanbul. The other three trips were for work, but this time we went for vacation, and you can see my wife and my son here. And we spent a week in Istanbul. And it was then that I discovered a lot of things about the Orient Express. So, this is what I call my chase of the Orient Express. But don't go only by what I'm saying. A number of authors have written about the Orient Express and their own travels on this at different times. So, here are 5 authors whom I read recently, and I'll tell you about what they found and what they felt about their journeys on the Orient Express over uh, a long period of time. Start between 1938. The first of these books was published in 1938, and the last was published in 2016. So first, let me share what Paul Theroux says. Paul Theroux is a very well-known travel writer. He's known for his book, The Great Railway Bazaar, although he's written a lot of other books also. So he says, and he traveled on this train in 1975 when it was in decline. So he says the Orient Express, once unique for its service, is now unique among trains for its lack of it. This picture on the right shows the Orient Express at its peak. But what does Mr. Theroux find? The Orient Express is more inadequate than the poorest Madrasi train, where you exchange stained lunch coupons for a tin tray of vegetables and a quart of rice. Not very complimentary, but the lower picture, shows what Mr. Theroux was missing on, on the Orient Express, which he could have got on any train in South India. Now, let me share 2 views of Trump's sasural. Now, sasural is a typical Hindi word. It's a rather juicy term for the family of one's spouse, and by extension, the place where they live and the society of that place. So, Christopher Portway passed through Ljubljana on the Orient Express in the early 70s, and he says, my present view of Ljubljana from the window of the Orient Express was of an industrial city, throbbing and pulsing in the night with tongues of flame licking at heavy smoke. 30 years later, Andrew Eames did the same thing. He traveled on Orient Express, whatever Orient Express was in those days. And this is what he found. Ljubljana is a pleasant, pocket-sized little city in a pleasant, pocket-sized little land, cobbled, tea-shoppy, with flurries of Art Nouveau and overlooked by a castle on an outcrop of rock. There is no similarity between the 2 descriptions. I don't know if the city changed in these 30 years or different people have different views depending on their own expectations and inclinations. Well, here's another quote from Paul Theroux. Now, this is when the train is approaching the end. It's somewhere in close to Turkey, probably Bulgaria or Romania. And it says, here and there was a yellow lantern, a fire far off, a light in a hut at a remote halt, where barely visible, the station master could be seen 5 paces from his hut, presenting his flag to the dawdling express. And here's a description of the end of the journey from the famous novelist John Dos Passos. He traveled on the Orient Express between the 2 world wars. And he says, suddenly the train is trapped between mustard-colored, crumbling walls. The line runs among rubbish heaps and cypresses. The train is hardly moving at all. It stops imperceptibly as if it was on a siding. Is it? No. Yes, it must be Constantinople. Here is a view of Istanbul Yard, a picture taken by Jack Burns, published in Life magazine in 1950. So this would be more or less similar to what John Dos Passos described in the last slide. And you can just see uh, the Hagia Sophia in the background. This brings us to the station in a Sultan's garden. This is the title of a presentation which I made some years ago after returning from Istanbul. But I'll share some of the information here, which is relevant to our topic today. Now, the story begins in the 1870s. Now, Istanbul, as you know, is a historic city which is very congested. It's on the sea shore, so there is no space for expansion. And this Sultan was very passionate about the railways, and he wanted to build a railway station in Istanbul. But he was told there's no space. So he made this famous statement. He said, I will run tracks through my own body if necessary to bring trains to Istanbul. And he almost did it. He gave away a part of his own garden, which was called Gulhane or Rose House. It was the garden of Topkapi Palace where he used to live. He gave away a part of this own garden to build the station. And the rest of the garden eventually became a public park. This is a picture I took of it in when we went there in 2019. Okay. So this is the exterior of Sirkeci station, this grand station which was built there in the 1880s. It's a straight. It looks curved in this because it was taken with a fisheye lens, but it's a straight front. And there are two clock towers, interestingly, perhaps because it is the meeting point of Asia and Europe. Now, before I come to my views on Sirkeci station, by the way, it's pronounced Sirkeci. C is pronounced as J in Turkish. I don't know why. So, Portway in 1972 calls it unimposing. Please note, not imposing, but unimposing. Eames in 2004 calls it elegant. Cheshire in 2016 calls it distinguished but faded. I don't know. I don't agree with any of these authors because what we saw was a magnificent station building with twin clock towers and round stained glass windows. But the only thing missing was trains. By then, there were no trains running on the station, which used to come to the station, but there was a metro station underneath this. In the first picture, you can see Raghu and Sonali, my son and my wife, standing in front of the station. And this little steam loco in the background is supposed to be from the batch of the steam locos, which had brought the Orient Express to Istanbul back in 1889. And here is a view of Sonali and myself standing in front of the building at night. The interior is truly magnificent. It's a masterpiece of architecture, whichever way you look at it, and it's beautifully preserved. Now, the thing which struck me was that the platform seemed too short for such a long train, but I found the answer in a book. One thinks of the Orient Express as a long train because it went a long way, but it seldom involved more than half a dozen carriages. As I mentioned earlier, at every major junction, they would attach and detach a few carriages. So, what eventually reached Istanbul was not more than half a dozen carriages, which could fit on this short platform. Now, there is a railway museum at Sirkeci station, which is worth visiting. And this is what it looks like. And it has a lot of relics of the Orient Express. Now, you can see some of them in this photograph. There is a lamp mounted on the wall. There is a mannequin wearing a conductor's uniform. There is a carved berth and a suitcase lying on it. There is an indicator lamp and a fire extinguisher and a steel sleeper on the floor. There are other things also. There are control charts. There are identity cards, and there is cutlery from the train. Now, Istanbul occupies a very important position on the world's railway map. Let me explain why. This is what Istanbul looks like. This is a night shot. Now, on the left, what you see is Europe, and on the right, what you see is Asia. And in between this little dark channel of water, which is as little as 5 or 6 kilometers wide at its minimum, is the Strait of Bosporus or Bosphorus. So, this is what separates Europe and Asia. On the European side, there is another small channel which is known as the Golden Horn, which because it's shaped like a horn. This separates the southern and northern parts of the city on the European side. The Sirkeci station is somewhere here on the European side, and this was never connected by train, even in the golden age of rail travel in the 1930s. There were two separate stations. I've already told you about Sirkeci station, which was here on the European side, and the corresponding station on the Asian side was called Haider Pasha. Now, the Simplon Orient Express would run on this side, on the European side, and the corresponding train was the Taurus Express, which would run on the Asian side, and you could take this all the way up to Baghdad and Basra, and from here you could take a ship to Bombay. And there was also a train, there was also a connection, which I believe has now been dismantled, which could take you to all the way to Cairo in Africa. So there were three continents meeting, the railways of three continents were meeting at this point: Europe, Asia, and Africa. But at this particular location across the Bosphorus, there was no connection, no train connection. So you would have to, if you were coming from Istanbul, you would have to get down. If you're coming from Europe, you would have to get down at Sirkeci and take a road vehicle or a boat across to the other side. Across this, on the other side, you would find this Haider Pasha station, which still exists, but there are no trains there, and its future is uncertain. It might get converted to a hotel. Now, let me tell you about one other thing connected with Pera Palace Hotel. I'll take another 10 minutes. I'm aware of the time. Now, Pera was the European quarter, the northern side of the European side. It was north of the Golden Horn, and it became a fashionable shopping district for European visitors. If you see this picture, you will note its resemblance with the Parisian street which I showed you in the beginning. Now it has been renamed Istiklal Caddesi, and it is still a premier shopping destination in Istanbul. It has banks, churches, and luxury hotels in the vicinity. But there was nothing good enough for the passengers who came here on the Orient Express. And so the Wagon Lee company decided to build its own hotel. They did this at a number of locations, the most important being Istanbul. And this is what it looks like. It still exists. This is a recent photo. And if you come out of this door, you step into the garden. On the wall, you will find this beautiful brass casting, which shows the crest of the Wagon Lee company. So this attracted the luxury clientele, which came on this train from different stations all across Europe. And it was also the Wagon Lee's company's office and a place for their own senior management to stay. We visited this place when we went to Istanbul in 2019. We had a cup of tea there, and it was very nice and very affordable, I must say. And this is what one of the authors has said, and I completely agree with this author, Andrew Martin. He wrote a book 1 year before we visited this place, and he says he found it flawlessly stylish, a soft focus film set of silver chandelier light white marble, burnished brass, and rich red turkey carpets. That's exactly what we experienced. Now, the elephant in the room, of course, is Agatha Christie. A lot of us have heard of the Orient Express because of Agatha Christie's book. And she actually stayed in this hotel several times between 1926 and 1932. Room number 411 is called the Agatha Christie room. And they have displayed some of her books there, and an old typewriter and antique furniture. And they charge double the tariff of the other similar rooms if you want to stay in this room. And they claim that the Orient Express, Murder on the Orient Express, was actually written in this room, although this is debated. But it is generally agreed that at least part of the book was written in this room, in this hotel. So we have talked about the various avatars of the Orient Express, the real Orient Express. And now let me come to the fictional Orient Expresses. So this, as you might guess, is Agatha Christie. And she says in her autobiography, all my life I had wanted to go on the Orient Express. When I had traveled to France or Spain or Italy, the Orient Express had often been standing at Calais, and I had longed to climb up into it. This was when she was traveling into other parts of Europe. And eventually, in the 1930s, in the 1920s and 1930s, she did travel on the Orient Express, and she based her book. The long shadow of Agatha Christie, people still think about her and her book when they travel on the Orient Express. Now, Andrew Eames traveled on this train, and he was thinking about this book. And he slept on this train, and in the morning, he asked the cabin attendant, "No murders last night?" And the cabin attendant replied, "No, sir." And from the way he said it, I suspect it was a question he had been asked many times. So many people were thinking of Murder on the Orient Express, but fortunately, they all survived. Here is a quote from the book itself. All around us are people of all classes, of all nationalities, of all ages. For 3 days, these people, these strangers to one another, are brought together. They sleep and eat under one roof. They cannot get away from each other. At the end of 3 days, they part. They go their several ways, never perhaps to see each other again. Now, this comes from a novel, but it is actually true that the people who used to meet on this train, or even today, people who meet on a train, they come as strangers, they interact, and then they part, and very often they will never see each other again. But coming to Agatha Christie and her book on the Orient Express, this was not her first book on the Orient Express. The first of her characters who traveled on the Orient Express was not Hercule Poirot. It was Parker Pyne, a lesser known character. And he traveled. If you remember, Hercule Poirot traveled. He came to Istanbul on the Taurus Express from Baghdad, and he crossed the Bosphorus and boarded the Orient Express from Sirkeci, and he was going west. Most of the books and most of the characters are traveling east from Paris. And Parker Pyne is one of them who traveled from Paris. And this is a very interesting description of the train at Paris. People were running up and down the platform. There were sellers of newspapers, of pillows, of chocolate, of fruit, and of mineral waters. You don't see scenes like this anymore in any station in Europe. So some of the important novels featuring the Orient Express. Maurice the Cobra wrote Madonna of the Sleeping Cars. This was in French in 1925. This was a trend-setting novel of those days. Then Graham Greene wrote Istanbul Train. Agatha Christie, of course, wrote Murder on the Orient Express. Eric Ambler wrote the Mask of Dimitros, and Ian Fleming wrote From Russia with Love. All these books were set on the Orient Express, and the train sort of plays a role in the story, in the plot. There are a lot of movies also. I'm not going into that. A lot of movies, a lot of television serials, a lot of plays have been made about the Orient Express. And we are coming to the end of the presentation. Let me share one last quote by Owen Hardy, who used to uh, organize luxury travels on railways in different parts of the world. He once gave a speech on the Orient Express in a club, and he says, as a part of the world's consciousness, the Orient Express is alive and well in art, literature, movies, popular culture, and luxury travel. Thank you. Thank you for traveling all the way.
Thank you very much, Atulya. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good. I must say a very well researched, very deeply researched presentation on the Orient Express. I'm quite certain that such kind of research on Orient Express may not be available in one place. I'm sure you must have gone through many documents, many sites, many Googles, probably AI to find all that you have presented. Anyway, thank you very much. It was a very well-researched and organized talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
I beg your pardon?
Thank you very much.
Okay. Anyway, there are some not really questions, but they are more like comments. Viraf Mullah writes, there used to be Bombay Express, which was also known as Peninsular and Oriental Bombay Express. It ran between Calais and Marseille, connecting with P&O liners to Bombay. Would you be aware of this?
I'm not aware of this, but it is not really part of the Orient Express. As I mentioned, there were a number of luxury trains. Orient Express was only one of them. And Orient Express was not a single train. It was a series of trains.
Yeah, because the next comment by Viraf sort of confirmed what you are saying. He says in 1984, I saw Orient Express with East European sleepers at Koblenz station. Wonder which Orient Express this was. So as you said, there were a number of Orient Expresses.
It was a kind of brand which was built. It was built as a brand, and this marketing was very successful.
Manikandan Venkatramanan asks, we were talking about the various coaches. Murder on the Orient Express took place on the Calais coach. The story is itself based on the murder of Charles Lindbergh's kid.
Yes, that's right.
Then Viraf Mullah says, I remember the cover of Popular Mechanics commenting about the end of the Orient Express as Murder of the Orient Express.
Yes, Murder of the Orient Express, yes.
Sushma Singh says, as interesting as reading a captivating novel.
Thank you.
I'm sure you know who Sushma Singh is.
Yes, yes.
Then Abhinav says, wonderful, hope it could go on. And Ramaswamy says, nice anecdotes. Rahul Sharma says, very informative and interesting talk, sir. Thank you very much. Looking forward to more such interesting talks.
Hello. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
The Gujarat Tourism Corporation ran a disaster of a train called the Royal Orient Express. They had taken the old coaches from the original Palace on Wheels, strung it together, but they didn't have a sort of theme. What was it supposed to represent? Palace on Wheels said, we'll treat you like a Maharaja. This occupation in this Royal Orient Express was so bad At times, I've seen it run with 2 passengers, non-paying passengers. And one day we got a booking for 53 people. We found it was the governor of Gujarat and his entourage, including 2 dogs. So I put a stop to it and became very unpopular with the Gujarat government. It was a dead loss to the railways, at least, because we were paying the haulage. We are not getting even the haulage charges.
Which year was this?
This was, I think, started soon after the broad gauge POW started.
Okay.
They took the old coaches and ran it on the meter gauge circuit. They were not clear what it was all about. They took you to the Gir forest sanctuary. They took you to Palitana temple. It was a mishmash of. It didn't have the passion and the dedication that the Rajasthan government had put into the original palace on wheels.
Thank you,
I'd
Anand.
I'd like to say something to what Mr. Anand just said. I'd like to add something to it. When initially the Palace on Wheels started, it was a meter gauge rake with original saloons of the Maharajas that used to run in Rajasthan. And later on, when the gauge conversion took place in Rajasthan, a new rake was built for running the Palace on Wheels in Rajasthan. And the old saloons which were released, they became this train in Gujarat, the Royal Orient, which you mentioned. But by then these coaches were very old and they were hard to maintain, and probably the marketing and the management was not as good as it had been on Palace and Wheels, and that's why it didn't last very long.
Thank you, Atulya. I have a very racy anecdote about the original Palace on Wheels, but that's not fit to be
Maybe this is
spoken.
not the place we
Some
can
other
have a
time,
separate
Yeah, I
talk
can
for you.
share it privately.
Some other time, sir.
Viraf Mullah says that there is an Orient Express in Thailand. So apparently the same Orient Express is a very common name
Yes.
and used quite often. Anyway, I have 1 or 2 questions. One is that was the Orient Express called Orient Express from the very first day? The very first day that it ran?
Initially, it didn't have a name, but the press started calling it Orient Express, or rather the French version of Orient Express, whatever it was. And then in 1891, if I remember correctly, it was officially changed to Orient Express in English.
Okay.
But this name was basically given by the media because they were so excited. And till then, it wasn't really going to the Orient. It was only going up to Istanbul, which was still in Europe.
Okay. Then who maintained the Orient Express? From what you said, it had slip coaches at various places.
Yes,
so I presume whichever country the slip coaches ran in,
it was
maintained there.
It was
but
very
the train
complicated.
maintained by, like in India, a train belongs to, say, depot in Bombay or a depot in Calcutta or a depot in Delhi. Does the train belong to any place?
As far as I know, it was maintained at both ends, and obviously the slip coaches would have to be maintained wherever they were going. And it was very complicated because these coaches were running through, but the locomotives were getting changed. They were getting changed. It was like interchange points. The locomotives and the crews, the drivers and the guards would belong to the country or the railway through which it was running. So they would keep getting changed. And but the coaches were the same, and the staff inside the coaches who were serving the passengers, they would remain the same and go from one end to the other end.
Okay, no, but even if the same staff had to go right through, language would have been a problem.
Language, yes, there was a condition that to become staff of this train, you must speak at least 3 European languages. So that was one of the conditions.
Anyway, we should give credit to India. We manage with virtually the same number of languages that Europe has.
In fact, there is an interesting comparison since you have raised this issue. There is a train which goes from Dwarka in Gujarat to Guwahati. It is 3,200 kilometers, almost the same distance as from Paris to Istanbul. And it takes about 67 hours, which is almost the same time as it runs once a week. But you're still in India. There are a number of zonal and divisional interchanges. But yes, there is a similarity.
No, a train that goes from north to south probably crosses about 7 or 8 languages.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Now, apart from languages and social systems, even the railways must have been different. For example, the signals must have been different. The operating system must have been different.
Yes, that's why it was important to have crews, the drivers and the guards from the country or the railway where it was running on.
See, I can
But-
understand. See, for example, in the old steam days, you had to change the steam locomotive at
Exactly.
short distances.
Exactly.
But once
Exactly.
you dieselized and electrified, the same locomotive could perhaps run right through. How did you manage that?
There wasn't much dieselization on this route as far as I know, but electrification, yes, it started back in the 30s, and especially through the Simplon tunnel that was electrified.
Of course, I'm
पांडे
also the
हे
ribbon.
स्वभावाने अबोल होते.
Please go ahead.
I said the electrification had taken place right from
Yeah,
the.
but I'm aware that there are a number of dual electric locomotives in Europe.
Yes,
which
because
keep changing
the electrification standards were different. They were running on AC or DC and different voltages. So they might have had locomotives which could adapt to that.
What about gauges? Did Bulgaria, countries like Bulgaria, Eastern Europe side have different gauge compared to the rest of Europe?
No, as far as I know, all these had standard gauge.
I think the only problem was in Russia. Russia had a different
Yes,
gauge.
Russia had that 5-foot gauge. Everyone else had standard gauge, and Spain and Portugal had broad gauge like us.
Okay. Anyway, thank you very much. It was an excellent, very well researched presentation. I learned more about not only the Orient Express, but trains in Europe today than I knew before, what I knew before. So thank you very much. And I hope to get more and more presentations of such kind from you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for your kind words.